The email arrived at 6:43 in the evening while Margaret Calloway was doing 80 miles an hour on Route 33 through the Blue Ridge Mountains with 3 empty coffee cups rolling around the passenger floor and a fourth balanced in the center console, still warm enough to matter. She'd read it at a red light in Waynesboro 20 minutes back, and the words had settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water, not a splash, just a slow, cold descent. Vote of no confidence. 30 days. He already has the numbers. The sender address was a string of random characters. No name, no explanation. Just that single sentence and a file attachment she hadn't opened yet because the light had turned green and because Margaret Calloway did not read attachments while driving even when her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. She hadn't told anyone about the email. Not her assistant, not her general counsel, not the 3 board members she spoke with daily and trusted at varying degrees. She'd closed the screen, set the phone face down on the seat beside her laptop bag, and driven. That was 40 minutes ago. The mountains had swallowed the last of the evening light somewhere around Staunton, and now the road ahead was the color of charcoal, the tree line pressing in from both sides, and the only things keeping her company were the hum of the engine and the particular silence that comes from being completely alone with something you can't yet name. She had closed a $340 million deal that morning. She had stood in front of a room full of men in identical suits and answered every question they threw at her without checking a single note, and when the lead partner from Whitmore and Associates had leaned across the conference table and asked her what made Calloway Group different from every other Mid-Atlantic holding company competing for this contract, she had looked him in the eye and said, "Because I know what we're worth, and I don't discount it." He'd laughed. Then he'd signed. That was this morning, 11 hours ago. The engine died on a long curve just past the Miller's Pass overlook, where the guardrail dropped away on the right and the mountain folded down into a valley that caught the last gray light of dusk. No warning knock, no temperature spike, no check engine light blinking a polite caution. Just silence, sudden and complete, and the steering going heavy in her hands as the power cut. She guided the car onto the gravel shoulder on instinct, the tires crunching to a stop 6 inches from where the road gave way to scrub brush and a 40-foot slope. She tried the ignition 4 times. The dashboard lit up each time, numbers and indicators glowing reassuringly, and then went dark when she turned the key. Not a sputter, not a cough, nothing. Her phone showed 1 bar, then none, then 1 again, like it was taunting her. She stepped out of the car and stood on the gravel shoulder with her jacket pulled tight against the wind coming off the mountain and looked in both directions at a road that was entirely empty in both directions and thought, of course, not panic. Margaret Calloway did not panic easily, and she was aware enough of her own psychology to know that the calm she felt right now was not composure so much as a kind of locked-down functionality. The same mechanism that had gotten her through her mother's funeral at 24 without crying until she was alone in her car in the parking lot of the church. The same mechanism that had let her sit across a table from the Calloway Group's previous board chair 12 years ago while he explained that he was leaving her the company because none of his children wanted the responsibility and received that information with nothing more than a measured nod. She functioned. She would function now. She popped the hood. She did not know enough about engines to diagnose anything specific, but she knew that popping the hood was the universal signal for "I am a person whose car has broken down," and if anyone drove past they would at least understand the situation at a glance. She walked to the front of the car and looked at the engine the way a person looks at a painting they don't quite understand, present, attentive, aware that something meaningful is probably happening, uncertain what to do about it. The wind picked up. The valley below the overlook had gone fully dark. Her heels were not designed for gravel shoulders, a fact she was registering with every small shift of weight, and somewhere in the middle distance a single vehicle's headlights appeared around the far curve of the road, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who knew this stretch of mountain and had nowhere urgent to be. She watched the lights grow and resolve into a pickup truck, blue or green. It was difficult to tell in the dusk, old enough that the paint had gone flat from years of sun. It slowed as it approached her the way people slow when they see a hood up and a woman standing in the near dark on a road with no shoulder lights and no other cars. The truck pulled in behind her. The door opened. The man who stepped out was tall in the straightforward way of someone who'd simply grown that way rather than cultivated it, broad through the shoulders, wearing a flannel shirt in a shade between blue and gray, dark jeans worn pale at the knees, work boots that had seen serious use. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone whose body had learned long ago that wasted motion cost something. He looked at the hood, then at her, and tilted his head a degree or two to the right, a small, considering angle, the way a person looks when they're taking in a problem before deciding how to approach it. Her chest registered something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not attraction, not recognition. More like the particular alertness that happens when something familiar passes by in a crowd and you turn too late to see what it was. His voice when he spoke was unhurried. "Engine? It won't start. Nothing. Not even a sound." He nodded once as though she had confirmed something he'd already suspected and walked past her to the front of the car without asking permission. He stood over the open hood, not touching anything yet, just looking the same focused stillness she'd noticed in his walk, applied now to the engine bay. He leaned in slightly, tilted his ear toward the block the way a doctor tilts a stethoscope. "When's the last time you had the battery serviced?" "I've owned it 6 months. I don't know its history before that." He reached in without hesitation and pressed 2 fingers to the positive terminal of the battery, then moved to the cable clamp and gave it a careful test of resistance. He straightened up and walked back to the truck without a word, opened the toolbox, bolted to the bed, and returned with a socket wrench and a wire brush no larger than a toothbrush. She stood back and watched him work. His hands were precise, not showy, not performed, just the specific confidence of someone who had done this particular thing hundreds of times and no longer needed to think about the mechanics. "There was corrosion on the positive terminal," he explained without looking up. "White powder buildup that broke the connection and told the battery nothing was home when she turned the key." He brushed it clean, reset the cable clamp, torqued it down with the socket wrench, and checked the ground cable on the other side with the same methodical attention. "Try it now," he said. She slid behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine, caught on the first rotation, settled immediately into a smooth idle, as if it had simply been waiting for someone who knew what to ask. She sat with both hands on the wheel for a moment before getting back out. Through the windshield, the mountains were dark shapes against a sky going purple at the edges, and he was standing at the front of the car, closing the hood with 2 hands, not slamming it. She noticed that. People who slammed hoods either didn't care or were showing off. He just closed it. She reached for her bag the moment she was out of the car. "What do I owe you, seriously? What's your rate?" He was already walking back toward the truck, wiping the wire brush against the leg of his jeans. "Nothing." "That's not acceptable. You stopped, you used your tools." "It took 10 minutes. He didn't turn around. "I'm not taking your money for tightening a bolt." There was nothing combative in it, no edge of pride or performance. He said it the way someone states a basic fact. Water is cold. Sky is dark. "I'm not taking your money for tightening a bolt," and the flatness of it closed the argument more effectively than any amount of insistence could have. She'd spent 12 years in rooms full of people who understood leverage, and she recognized the particular unmovable quality of someone who simply didn't want anything from her. She pulled a business card from the inner pocket of her jacket instead. "Then take this. If you're ever in Richmond and need anything." He came back for the card, took it with 2 fingers, looked at it for a moment longer than people usually look at business cards, and something happened in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like a recognition that arrived and then was quietly set aside. "Margaret Calloway, CEO, Calloway Group." His eyebrows made a small controlled adjustment. He tucked the card into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. "Drive safe," he said. He climbed back into the pickup. The engine turned over easily the way old trucks do when they've been properly maintained, and he pulled back onto Route 33 and accelerated into the curve ahead. The taillights grew smaller, smaller. Then the mountain took them, and the road was empty. She stood on the gravel shoulder and watched the dark for longer than made any practical sense. Something about the tilt of his head, the angle of it, the specific geometry of that pause before he committed to a decision. She knew that angle. She was certain she knew that angle, and equally certain she was wrong, because the things we're certain of at dusk on empty mountain roads are rarely the things we're still certain of in the morning. She got back in the car. She sat for a moment with the engine running and the heat coming through the vents and her hands in her lap. I want to remember this night forever. She hadn't thought about that sentence in years. She had thought about it constantly for years, and then at some point she couldn't locate precisely. She had stopped the way you stop hearing a sound that's been present long enough. But now it was there, immediate and specific, as though someone had switched it back on. October 2009. Westfield University. She'd been 22, a scholarship student from outside Roanoke who bought her textbooks secondhand and ate pasta 4 nights a week and wore the same 3 pairs of jeans in rotation, and told herself that none of this was permanent, that the scholarship was a door, and she was walking through it regardless of how the door looked. The library closed at 11. She'd stayed until the last possible minute the way she always did, because the library was warm and her dorm room had a radiator that worked approximately half the time. 3 men or 3 boys, the distinction felt important even then, though she couldn't have articulated why had been on the library steps when she came out, not waiting for anything in particular. Just present in the specific way of people who've had enough to drink that the night has become open-ended and other people have become interesting in the wrong kind of way. They'd spread across the steps when they saw her, not quite blocking the path, blocking it enough. She'd frozen. Not the dramatic freeze of films. She hadn't dropped anything, hadn't made a sound. She'd simply stopped walking and stood there in the cold with her backpack and her second-hand coat and the very clear understanding that her usual tools, competence, directness, the ability to outthink a room, were not tools that applied here. He'd come from the direction of the parking lot. She hadn't noticed him approach because her attention was entirely elsewhere, and then he was just there between her and the 3 men on the steps, standing in a way that was not threatening and not aggressive and somehow more effective than either. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anyone. He simply occupied the space with a quality of absolute certainty. This situation is over now, and the 3 men on the steps looked at him and recalculated and left, not quickly, not with any acknowledgement that they were leaving because of him, but leaving. He turned to her, that tilt of the head. "You okay?" His name was Daniel. He was in her physics lecture. She'd seen him back row left side, the one who always arrived just before the professor did and left immediately after, who she had clocked as someone with a job on top of class, someone whose time was managed tightly. She had not spoken to him before that night. People you sit near in large lectures are frequently people you never actually meet. They'd walked back toward the residence halls together and had not stopped talking once they started. She couldn't reconstruct the whole conversation. Now it had the fluid quality of a night that belonged entirely to itself. But she remembered the shape of it. They were both there on borrowed time, and they both knew it. Both from places where a university scholarship was something you held carefully. Both slightly uncertain about whether they were allowed to be here, and both too stubborn to let that uncertainty show to anyone but each other. She'd told him things she hadn't told anyone else, not because the night had any magic quality, but because he listened without looking for an angle, and she hadn't realized until that moment how rarely that happened. When the sky had started to lighten somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning, he'd kissed her carefully, briefly, as though testing whether it was real, and then pulled back and looked at her with an expression she had no category for at the time, and still didn't quite, and said, "I want to remember this night forever." 2 days later, she looked for him in the physics lecture. His seat was empty. She looked for him the day after. Empty again. She asked someone who sat near him vaguely, casually, not wanting to expose the fact that the question mattered, and learned only that he'd left school. No one knew why. No one had a number. He was Daniel from physics back row, and then he was nothing. She had spent the next several months in a state she didn't name to herself, not grief, which required a loss you had a right to claim, but something duller and more persistent, a background-level awareness that a door had opened and closed in rapid succession, and she hadn't gotten through it. Eventually, that faded the way things do when you're 22, and the present requires all your attention. She built forward. She kept building. She got very good at building. On Route 33, with the engine running and the mountains dark on all sides, Margaret Calloway pulled out her phone. 1 bar. She typed with both thumbs, "Daniel Rourke, Auto Repair, Blue Ridge, Virginia. Rourke's Auto and Body, Mill Haven, Virginia. Established 2011. General Repair Diagnostics Classic Restoration. The website was 3 pages and a contact form. The About page had a photograph. A man standing in front of a white garage building with 2 bay doors open behind him, arms crossed, squinting slightly into direct sunlight. A small girl with an extraordinary amount of dark curly hair balanced on the hood of a car behind him, with her arms spread wide for balance, grinning at whoever held the camera. He was smiling at something off to the left, not at the camera, not posed, just caught. She knew the smile. She had seen it once 15 years ago in the blue-gray light before dawn on a campus bench in Westfield, Virginia, and she had never entirely stopped seeing it. Her hands were not steady the way they had been during the board meeting. She noticed that. She drove. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a building on the south side of Richmond with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked east over the James River, and on clear mornings the light came in at an angle that turned everything in the kitchen gold for approximately 40 minutes before the day normalized. Margaret had bought it 7 years ago because it was the best available unit in the best available building, and she had just signed the papers that made her CEO of a company with assets approaching $2 billion, and it had seemed like the right kind of decision for that particular moment. She sat on the kitchen floor at 11:30 at night with her suit jacket over the back of a chair and her heels somewhere near the front door where she'd stepped out of them, and a glass of wine she hadn't poured yet standing on the counter above her. She sat on the floor, specifically not at the table, not on the couch. The floor was something she'd done since college when a problem required full attention. There was something about removing the option to lean back that kept her honest. The file attachment on the anonymous email was a single document board meeting minutes from a closed session 6 weeks ago. She had not been present at that session. She had not known it occurred. Preston Hale's name appeared 11 times in 14 pages. Her name appeared twice, both times in a context that framed her opposition to the Hargrove Capital merger as a liability rather than a position. CEO has demonstrated consistent resistance to strategic growth opportunities. That was the language. Not the CEO has concerns, not the CEO has presented counter-arguments. Resistance. She closed the document, opened her browser. Daniel Rourke's Facebook profile was public. She was aware distantly that this was not entirely normal behavior, and she had the capacity to care about that in the abstract. In the morning she would care probably, but right now the awareness sat at the edge of her attention and made no serious demands. The profile was sparsely maintained in the way of someone who used it primarily to post things for specific people rather than to curate a presence. Photographs of a child. The dark-haired girl from the website photograph identified in a post from 2 years ago as Lily, age 6, who had apparently won second place in a school science fair with a project about why volcanoes were better than earthquakes. A photograph from what appeared to be a camping trip in the mountains, the girl asleep in a sleeping bag with a book about prehistoric animals open across her face. A photograph of her in a school play visibly committed to a role that appeared to involve a cardboard crown, and 4 photographs back shared every December. For the past 5 years, the same image each time, a woman in her late 20s laughing at something outside the frame, outdoor light hair, dark and wind-blown, the mountains in the background. The caption was different each year in its specifics and identical in its weight. This year it said 5 years. You would have thought this was hilarious. The year before 5 years. Lily has your laugh. Margaret Calloway sat on her kitchen floor and looked at the photograph for a long time. She found the article from the Millhaven Valley Courier in a search that took 4 minutes. December 2019, a single-vehicle accident on Route 250 during a winter storm. Sarah Ann Rourke, 31 years old. Millhaven resident, survived by her husband Daniel and their daughter Lily, age 3. There was a photograph of a fundraiser the town had organized for the family the following spring. There was a brief quote from the owner of Patton's Hardware, a man named Marcus Webb, who said, "Dan's the kind of man this town doesn't let fall. We make sure of that." She set the phone face down on the tile floor of her kitchen. The penthouse was very quiet in the particular way of expensive spaces, not silent because the building had its own white noise of climate systems, and the river made a distant presence through the glass, but quiet in a way that emphasized the absence of other people. She had 4,000 square feet. She ate dinner at the kitchen island because the dining table was too large for one person, and setting a single place at it felt worse than not using it. She had not cooked a real meal in this kitchen in 6 weeks, possibly longer. There was a Calloway Group refrigerator magnet on the stainless steel door that her assistant had put there as a joke, and that she had never removed, and it was the most personal item in the room. She had built this. She had chosen this. She had been clear-eyed about the trade-offs, and she had made them deliberately because the alternative was to remain the scholarship student from outside Roanoke who patched her coat 3 times and couldn't afford to fail. She had not failed. She had not failed at anything professional in 12 years, and the idea that Preston Hale, who had once presented a financial model in a board meeting that contained a basic arithmetic error she'd caught in 30 seconds, was going to be the thing that ended her tenure at Calloway Group was not something she could take seriously as a possibility. But the email sat in her chest, cool and specific. She had driven an hour through the mountains tonight, and a stranger had fixed her car and refused her money and taken her card with an expression she recognized from 15 years ago and hadn't been able to place until the taillights disappeared. And now she was sitting on the floor of her $4 million kitchen at midnight, thinking about a conversation she'd had at 22 on a campus bench with someone whose last name she hadn't known, trying to calculate how much of what she felt right now was real and how much was the particular vulnerability of a bad day finding a crack and widening it. She picked up the phone, typed again. Rourke's Auto and Body, Millhaven, Virginia owner. More results this time. A review from 3 years ago. Dan Rourke fixed my '98 Silverado in 2 hours and charged me half of what the dealer quoted. Good man. This is what a local business should be. A mention in the Millhaven Valley Courier from 2021. A community profile. Daniel Rourke, 35, took over his father's repair shop at 23 and has operated it continuously since serving the Millhaven area for over a decade. He is known locally for his diagnostic work on older vehicles and for pricing that reflects, as he puts it, what the job actually costs, not what people will pay if they're desperate. She read that last clause twice. She opened the board minutes document again and scrolled to the section on Hargrove Capital. $1.2 billion. Real estate holdings. Insurance subsidiaries. 3 regional banks. The acquisition would make Calloway Group the 4th largest holding company in the Mid-Atlantic. The analysts who'd modeled it called it transformative. Preston called it visionary. Margaret had called it in the closed board session 2 months ago, a vehicle for the systematic elimination of redundant personnel across merged entities, which in human terms meant approximately 1,200 people in a company with 3,400 employees losing their jobs within 18 months of closing. Preston had described her objection in those minutes she was reading right now on her kitchen floor as resistance to strategic growth opportunities. She closed the document, set the phone down, sat with the quiet for a long moment. Then she picked it back up and typed a single search, Vanguard Life Insurance Calloway Group subsidiary. She already knew it was a subsidiary. She'd known since she reviewed the asset portfolio when she took the job. What she did not know until the results loaded and she clicked through 3 pages in the span of 15 minutes was why a man in Millhaven, Virginia had looked at her business card with an expression she couldn't fully read and said nothing. The lawsuit was a matter of public record. Rourke versus Vanguard Life Insurance Company filed. March 2020, dismissed with prejudice, October 2021. She found the case summary on a legal database she had access to through the company's general counsel account. The plaintiff, Daniel James Rourke, Millhaven, Virginia, seeking enforcement of a $250,000 life insurance policy following the death of Sarah Ann Rourke. The defendant's basis for denial, a pre-existing condition exclusion in the policy's secondary appendix applicable to a documented history of anxiety treatment, concluded 3 years prior to purchase. The policyholder had not been informed of this exclusion at time of sale. The case had run for 18 months. The plaintiff had been represented by a local attorney whose practice was primarily real estate and estate planning, not insurance litigation. The defendant had been represented by Vanguard Life's in-house legal team, which had 4 attorneys dedicated to exactly this category of denial dispute. The dismissal was technical. The exclusion language, however obscure and however inadequately disclosed, was present in the contract the policyholder had signed. Margaret sat with this for a long time. He had known when he pulled up behind her on Route 33. He had read the business card and known. And he had closed the hood of her car and said drive safe and gotten back in his truck. And when she thought about the expression that had passed across his face when he looked at her card, she understood now that it wasn't surprise and it wasn't admiration. It was the particular quiet of a person who has already processed something difficult and made his peace with it and decided that the appropriate response is to continue doing what's right regardless. She sat on the floor of her kitchen until after 1 in the morning. She did not pour the wine. When she finally got up and turned off the lights, she left the phone on the counter and stood at the window for a minute with the river below her and the city spread out in both directions, and thought about a man who had fixed her car for free because it was the right thing to do, and about a policy exclusion buried in a secondary appendix, and about a little girl who had been 3 years old when she lost her mother and who now slept with books about prehistoric animals and came second in science fairs about volcanoes. She woke up at 5:45 and lay in bed for 12 minutes, which was unusual. She was normally up and moving within 3 minutes of consciousness, had been since her 20s. The 12 minutes were spent looking at the ceiling and having the honest conversation with herself that the previous night's kitchen floor version had been approaching but not quite arriving at. She wanted to go back. She had already decided she was going back, had made the decision somewhere around 1 in the morning without formally acknowledging it, and the 12 minutes were just the process of catching her reasoning up to the conclusion. She would tell herself it was about the Vanguard file, about doing the right thing by a situation her company had contributed to. That was true. It was also not the whole truth, and Margaret Calloway had not built what she'd built by lying to herself about her own motivations. At 6:15 she called her assistant and moved 2 morning meetings. At 7 she was on Route 64, heading west with the first real coffee of the day in the cup holder, and the mountains ahead of her in early light, still mostly green in October at the lower elevations, going orange and red at the ridge lines where the cold had gotten there first. Millhaven was 40 minutes off the interstate, down a 2-lane state road that curved through farms and small subdivisions and a stretch of second-growth forest before opening into a town that occupied a modest valley between 2 ridges. The main street was 4 blocks, a hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, a barber shop, a small branch bank, a church whose sign read, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers need coffee." Sundays 9 a.m. and a building she recognized from the website photograph with 2 open bay doors and a hand-painted sign above them that said Rourke's Auto and Body in dark green letters, the paint around the ampersand slightly fresher than the rest, as though it had been touched up at some point. She parked across the street and sat in the car. Through the bay door she could see a lifted pickup on the hoist and a pair of legs in dark work pants beneath it, and through the glass door of the small office attached to the front of the building. She could see a woman at a desk who appeared to be in her early 60s. Silver hair cut close, reading something, and leaning against the open bay door was a man she recognized from the website photograph, but not only from the website photograph, talking to the man under the hoist, his voice inaudible through the glass. And then he laughed at something. A short, real laugh, not a performance, and turned his head at an angle she knew. She sat with her hand on the door handle for 3 full minutes. Then he looked up, looked across the street. There was a moment where she couldn't tell if he'd actually registered her car or was just looking at the street in general. But then he raised one hand, palm out, a single unhurried wave, the kind that says, "I see you come in when you're ready." And there was no version of sitting in the car any longer that made any kind of sense. The office smelled like coffee and motor oil and the faint chemical sweetness of brake cleaner, and the woman at the desk looked at her over reading glasses with the direct, rapid appraisal of someone who had spent decades being the first point of contact for a business and had developed reliable instincts about which customers were going to be straightforward and which were going to require management. "Help you with something? I'm looking for—" Margaret stopped because he was already walking through the interior door, wiping his hands on a red shop rag, and he was looking at her with an expression that was carefully neutral, in the way that careful neutrality always reveals itself. "Hi," she said, and it came out smaller than she intended. "Car's okay." His voice had the same quality she remembered from the road, unhurried, no performance. "The car is fine. I just—" She held up the bag. A deli in Richmond had been open at 7, and she had purchased sandwiches without fully examining her reasoning. I brought lunch, if you have time. Something moved across his face, not suspicion, not pleasure, something more considered than either. He looked back through the door toward the bay, then at the woman at the desk who was looking at her paperwork with the concentrated attention of someone who is absolutely listening. "Ruth," he said. The woman did not look up. 45 minutes. Go." Millie's diner had 6 booths and a counter with 8 stools and a chalkboard menu that changed daily, and the woman behind the counter, Millie, presumably late 50s, apron the look of someone who knew the order before you sat down, set a coffee in front of him before he'd fully settled into the booth. She looked at Margaret, looked at him, looked at Margaret again, and went back to the counter. He unwrapped the sandwich without commenting on the quality of the ingredients or the Richmond deli bag, which she noticed and appreciated. She sat across from him and tried to think of how to start. He got there first. "I looked you up last night," he said. Not accusatory, just establishing that they were operating with the same information. "After I got home, Calloway Group." He paused. "You've built something serious." "I've worked at it." "That's not what I mean." He turned the coffee cup on the saucer a small rotation, then back. "I mean, you started from somewhere and you built something serious, and most people don't do that. I'm not saying it as a compliment particularly, just as a fact." The diner was half full around them. Someone was telling someone else about a problem with a fence line. The coffee was stronger than anything she'd had in Richmond in a year. "Westfield University," she said. "Fall semester 2009. Physics with Professor Morrison." He went very still. "October 23rd. The library steps. 11 at night." His stillness was not the stillness of someone trying to remember. It was the stillness of someone who had remembered and was deciding what to do with it. "You had a blue jacket," he said slowly, "patched at both cuffs. You'd done it yourself. The stitching was a different color than the fabric. I patched it 3 times total before it finally wasn't worth saving." "Glasses." He looked at her. "Thin frames. You kept taking them off when you got tired and holding them in your hand instead of putting them away." The diner noise continued around them, and neither of them was part of it. "Dan." She hadn't planned to say his name specifically, but she said it, and she watched the effect of it, not dramatic. Nothing theatrical, just the arrival of something that had been traveling a long time. "I looked for you, for weeks after. No one knew where you'd gone. My mother called at 4 in the morning. His voice was even the flatness of something said many times inside one's own head. "Stage 3. I was home by that evening. I didn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't have a way to reach you. I didn't even have your last name. You were Meg from physics. You called me Meg from the beginning. I don't know why I liked that." "I looked for you too," he said. "For a while, after things settled down with my mother. But there were a lot of Margarets who'd been at Westfield that year, and I didn't know your major or your last name or your dorm. I got to a point where it felt like I was looking for something that wasn't meant to be found." The coffee cooled between them. "I recognized something last night," she said. "Not your face, not your name. The way you tilted your head before you decided to look at the engine. This specific angle." She showed him a small tilt, maybe 15 degrees. "You did that on the library steps when you turned around after they left. I'd forgotten I remembered it." He looked at her for a long moment across the table. "I knew the car," he said. "Before you told me who you were. The decal on the rear window, Calloway Group fleet vehicles use it. I knew what company the car belonged to." She understood the implication of that before he said it. She had known it since 1 in the morning on her kitchen floor. But hearing it said aloud was different from knowing it. "Vanguard life," she said. "I still stopped." His voice held nothing accusatory, no bid for credit. "Because you were a person standing on a mountain road in the dark and your car didn't work, and that had nothing to do with anything else. Sarah would have been angry with me if I'd driven past." He lifted his coffee cup. "I figure I owe the world a few right things. She taught me that." There it was, said plainly without drama in the back booth of a diner in a mountain town, and it landed in the middle of her chest with the quiet force of something true. She did not tell him about the Vanguard file that night, Not because she was hiding it, she knew with the same clarity that had gotten her through 12 years of difficult rooms that she would tell him that not telling him was not an option she would take. But because they had 45 minutes, and there were things that had been waiting 15 years, and a booth in Millie's diner was the wrong place for a conversation that would require everything she had. She told him about Westfield instead, about the scholarship and the patched coat and the pasta 4 nights a week. He told her about leaving school and coming home to Millhaven and taking over his father's shop at 23 because his father's hands had started to give him trouble and someone had to do it. He told her about learning the business from the ground up, not just the mechanical work which he already knew, but the accounting, the scheduling, the particular skill of telling someone their car needs more than they can pay for without making them feel like the situation is their fault. He did not tell her about Sarah not that day. She did not ask. There was a shape to what was being said and what was being held back, and she respected both. When the 45 minutes were up, he left $3 on the table and stood, and she stood, and they walked out into the October sun on the main street of Millhaven, Virginia, and he said, "Thank you for the lunch," which was not what she wanted him to say, but was true and was enough for now. She got back in the car, drove 2 blocks south on Main Street, turned onto a side street and stopped. The river of the town's edge was visible between 2 buildings. The mountains sat behind everything permanent and impervious. Her phone buzzed. Preston Hale. She picked up. "I know where you were today," he said before she could speak. The warmth in his voice was the careful warmth of someone who has practiced it. "Millhaven, charming area. But the board meets Friday, Meg, and I'd strongly suggest you spend the next 72 hours in Richmond rather than rural Virginia." "I'll be at the meeting, Preston." "Good." A pause calibrated to feel like generosity. "And Meg, the man who fixed your car, Rourke. You should know there's some history there between his family and one of our subsidiaries. It might complicate things if you're not careful." His voice went lighter, a simulation of friendly concern. "I'd hate for anyone to suggest you've been compromised." He ended the call before she could respond. She held the phone for a moment, looking at the blank screen. Then she opened her email, navigated to the anonymous message, read the second line again, the line she had skimmed past in Waynesboro because she'd been driving, and the first line had taken all her attention. "Check Vanguard Life Claims 2019. File Rourke S. Preston had known. He'd called to tell her he knew, framed as a warning. And the warning was real, in the way that all warnings from people who want something from you are real. It told her exactly what he intended to use and precisely when he intended to use it. She had 30 days. He had a file and the knowledge of what was in it and the willingness to deploy both. The mountains were the same mountains they'd been an hour ago. Millhaven was quiet in the midday way of small towns on weekdays. A few cars on the main street, a delivery truck parked outside the pharmacy, someone's dog tied to a post outside the hardware store, sitting with the philosophical patience of dogs who have been tied to posts before and know the weight is finite. She started the car, pulled out of the side street, turned north on Main Street, and drove back past Rourke's auto and body without stopping, because the next conversation had to come from her on her terms, and she needed to know more before she could have it honestly. She needed the file. All of it, not just the case summary. She needed to know what Vanguard Life had done in detail before she could walk through that door and say the things that needed to be said. She got on the state road heading back toward the interstate, called her general counsel from the car voice command hands on the wheel. When he answered, she said, "I need every Vanguard Life denial file from the last 7 years that involved a pre-existing condition exclusion. Everything. I want it on my desk Monday morning." A silence on the other end. "That's a significant number of files, Margaret." "Monday morning," she said, and ended the call. The mountains were in the rearview mirror, orange and red at the ridge lines. Miller's Pass was somewhere back there in the folds of the ridge, just a curve in a road that she would probably drive again, and the gravel shoulder where she'd stood in the near dark while a man she'd been looking for without knowing it fixed what was broken and asked nothing in return. She drove. The Vanguard files arrived Monday morning in 4 banker's boxes stacked outside her office door, organized with the kind of thoroughness that meant her general counsel had worked through the weekend. She didn't comment on that. She thanked him for the quality of the cross-referencing tabbed chronological sorted by denial category, and sent him home at noon because he had the particular hollowness of a man who had slept in his office twice in 3 days and was operating on institutional loyalty rather than anything resembling adequate rest. She read for 6 hours without stopping. 41 files in 7 years. She had been told to expect the pre-existing condition denials to number in the low 20s. The actual figure was higher because the intake team had flagged additional cases where similar exclusion language had been applied in ways that Vanguard's own underwriting guidelines, read with any care, did not clearly support. 41 policies. 41 people who had sat across from an agent signed their name to a document that contained language voiding their coverage under circumstances the agent had not explained and that no reasonable policyholder could have anticipated from the signing page alone. The Rourke file was the 9th she read, not because she was looking for it, but because 2019 was the 3rd year in the chronological sequence. Sarah Ann Rourke, policy number VL-2019-441872, purchased 11 months before her death. The exclusion language was on page 14 of a 22-page document. The section initialing page where policyholders confirmed they had read and understood each major provision did not include page 14 subsection. It was not an oversight anyone had corrected in the 7 years since the exclusion category had been added to the standard form. The aggregate denial amount across all 41 cases was $4.3 million. The amount Vanguard had spent defending those denials in legal fees over the same period was just over $1.1 million. She sat with that arithmetic for a long time. $3.2 million in net benefit set against 41 families who had purchased insurance because they were trying to be responsible adults in an uncertain world, and against whatever it cost each of those families when the check didn't arrive. She called her general counsel at 6:30 that evening. "I want an independent audit of all 41 cases. External firm, no prior relationship with Vanguard or any Calloway subsidiary. I want their assessment of which denials were defensible under our own policy language correctly interpreted and which were not." A pause. "Margaret, if we commission an audit that concludes a significant portion of those denials were improper, we're creating a document that plaintiff's counsel could—" "I know what we're creating. Commission it." She ended the call, sat with the 4 bankers' boxes and the Richmond skyline going dark outside the glass, and thought about a man who had pulled $40,000 out of a shop his father had built money that had taken years to accumulate money. He would have to earn back 1 oil change and brake job at a time to hire a local attorney to fight for 18 months on behalf of a policy that should never have been denied in the first place, and who had then 5 years later pulled over on a mountain road because a woman was stranded, and it was the right thing to do regardless of whose name was on her business card. She drove to Millhaven on Wednesday. Not because everything was resolved, not because she knew exactly how to have the conversation that was coming. She drove because the alternative was to sit in Richmond managing the Vanguard situation from a distance, while Preston Hale moved pieces on a board she wasn't watching closely enough, and because she was honest enough with herself alone in the car on Route 33 in the early morning, with the mountains rising ahead, to acknowledge that she also simply wanted to go. That want was unfamiliar in the specific way of things you've rationed for so long that the act of wanting them at full strength feels almost alarming. Ruth was unlocking the front door when Margaret pulled in across the street. She waited until the office lights came on before getting out because arriving before a business opened felt like presuming on a welcome she hadn't fully earned yet. The October morning was cold and still, the kind of clarity that only exists in mountain air before the day warms and complicates it. Ruth held the door without being asked. Inside, coffee was already running. Ruth had started it before unlocking because Ruth operated on the principle that preparation was a form of respect for other people's time. "He's in the bay," Ruth said and returned to her desk. Through the interior window, Margaret could see Dan already at work on a vehicle on the lift back to the glass, moving with the focused economy she'd been watching for 2 weeks now, and still found each time a little startling in its completeness, the way a man looks when what he's doing and who he is are not separate things. He sensed the change in light through the window and turned, and his expression when he saw her was the careful non-expression of someone who had been thinking about something and had not yet decided how much of that thinking to show. He came through the interior door wiping his hands, and Ruth set 2 coffees on the counter between them without looking up from her work, and Margaret said before anything else could organize itself into small talk, "I need to tell you something, before anything else happens today." He waited, which was his way. "I've known about the Vanguard case since the night I drove home from Miller's Pass. I found the file that night. I read it Monday alongside 40 others like it, and I've commissioned an independent audit of every denial in the same category." She held his eyes because looking away would be a form of management, and this conversation didn't deserve that. "I didn't know about it when I took the job 7 years ago. I should have looked harder at what Vanguard was doing with these exclusion clauses, and I didn't, and that sits with me regardless of what I knew or didn't know at the time. I'm not telling you this to ask for anything. I'm telling you because you deserve to know, and because I'm not willing to keep sitting across from you while this is sitting between us, unsaid." The shop made its small ambient sounds around them. Something settling in the bay. The coffee machine finishing its cycle. Dan looked at the counter for a moment, then he looked at her. "When were you going to say it?" "Today. It's Wednesday." "I know." His silence after that was not accusation. It was the silence of someone processing information they had already partially arrived at on their own and were now confirming. He picked up one of the coffees. "Come outside." The bench in front of the shop faced Main Street, which at 8 in the morning had the unhurried pace of a place with no performance pressure, a woman walking a dog past the pharmacy, the hardware store lights coming on a truck making an early delivery to Millie's. Marcus came out to sign for something at his loading dock in a canvas work jacket, saw them on the bench and raised his thermos once in their direction. He didn't go back in immediately. He stood there for a moment looking at Dan the way a man looks at someone he's known through the worst of it and is now watching something different take shape. Then, quiet enough that it was clearly not meant for her, but not quiet enough that she couldn't hear, "Man who fixes what's broken and asks nothing back, that's not small, Dan. That's rare." He went inside. The door shut. Dan looked at his coffee cup. "She bought that policy because I asked her to," Dan said, his voice carrying the quality of something said aloud for the first time after being held internally for a long time. "I found the rate. I called the agent. I told Sarah it was the responsible thing to do. She thought it was money we could use elsewhere. She went along with it because I asked her to." He drank the coffee. "And when it should have meant something, it didn't. Because of language on a page nobody walked us through." Margaret didn't try to reframe it or soften the edges. There are things that only require being heard, and this was one of them. "I'm going to make it right," she said, when the weight of it had been properly acknowledged. "Not just your case. All 41, whatever the audit determines, should have been paid. And I'm restructuring the exclusion policy across all Vanguard products so this category of problem can't repeat." She paused. "I'm doing this because it's wrong and it needs to be fixed. I want to be clear that it would be happening regardless of anything between you and me." He looked at her directly. "Then why tell me yourself instead of letting me get a letter?" "Because you'd get the letter and know I'd known, and that sequence would mean something. I'd rather you hear the order of events from me." She held his gaze. She held his. "And because the most important thing I needed to say to you, I wasn't willing to keep arranging conversations around not saying." He was quiet long enough that a car passed on Main Street, and the dog walker came back the other direction with a second dog she hadn't had on the first pass. Then he said, "My dad built that shop with one bay and a used lift. He handed it to me because his hands gave out, not because he was finished. He just couldn't do the fine work anymore. The $40,000 I spent on the lawsuit was his money as much as mine." He looked down the street. "I'm not angry at you personally. I was for about 2 days after the newspaper article, and then I had to stop because being angry at a name on a building doesn't fix anything. Be angry if you need to. I can take it." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one. "I'll keep the option open," he said. And something shifted in the air between them, not resolved, but no longer obstructed. What followed over the next 2 weeks had a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. She drove to Millhaven on Wednesday and Friday, then Monday of the following week, then Thursday. She told her assistant she was working remotely, which was true. She brought real work. The Vanguard restructuring proposal, the independent audit coordination, the Hargrove due diligence she was quietly running through a firm Preston didn't know she used. She sat in the corner of the waiting area with her laptop and the Wi-Fi that Ruth had personally negotiated to an acceptable speed 3 years prior and worked while the shop moved around her. What she was learning across those days was the texture of a place that operated on a different accounting than she was accustomed to. On a Tuesday, she watched Dan quote a repair to an elderly woman, a 2003 sedan, the kind of job that had a going rate, and then charge her roughly half of it, explaining afterward to no one in particular that Mrs. Patton had been a customer since the shop opened and had been managing alone since her husband passed, and that the market rate for a job was not always the same as the right rate for a job. On a Thursday, she sat in the waiting area while Dan spent 20 minutes on the phone with a man in Staunton who had questions about a repair he'd had done elsewhere, questions Dan had no obligation to answer and no financial interest in answering, and answered them anyway because the man needed the information and had nowhere else to get it. She had spent 12 years in rooms where every action had a calculus. Watching someone operate without one she was discovering a specific kind of education. Lily arrived off the school bus on Friday at 3:15 with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and her hair asserting its independence from whatever arrangement it had started the day in. She stopped when she saw Margaret at the corner table and conducted the rapid and unsentimental assessment of a child who has learned to read rooms. "You came back," Lily said. "I did." Lily dropped her backpack under the counter and climbed into the waiting area chair across from Margaret with the boneless ease of someone for whom furniture is primarily a suggestion. She pulled a library book from the top of her pack, the Cretaceous period heavily illustrated, and opened it, and they sat in companionable quiet for 20 minutes, while Dan's voice carried through from the bay, explaining something to a customer with the patient precision he brought to making technical information accessible without condescension. On Saturday morning, Dan showed her the back of the property, the raised beds gone to fall dormancy. Lily's section near the fence demarcated by a row of painted rocks in primary colors, the collection within it organized according to a logic that was entirely Lily's own smooth stones from different sources. A bird's nest on a small wooden frame, 3 pine cones arranged by size, and a broken pocket watch displayed face up on a flat piece of slate. "She found it in a box of my father's things," Dan said. "He brought it back from a trip out west 40 years ago and always meant to get it repaired." Margaret crouched and looked at the watch. The hands were stopped at 2:17. The glass face had a clean diagonal crack. The case had been recently polished, not restored, just maintained. "She cleans it. Every couple of weeks. She says things that can't be fixed anymore still deserve to be taken care of." Margaret looked at the watch for a moment that had nothing to do with the watch. Then she stood and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the watch hadn't already said better. The conversation with Ruth happened on the second Wednesday in the 10-minute window after Dan left for the parts supplier in Staunton and before Lily's bus. Ruth set her reading glasses on the desk with the deliberate placement of someone transitioning from one mode to another. "You knew about Vanguard before you told him?" "Yes." "How long?" "Since the night on the road." Ruth looked at her with the calibrated attention of someone who has watched a great many people move through difficult situations and has developed reliable instincts about which ones will hold. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer." "All right. Are you here because this place feels like breathing compared to wherever you came from, or are you here because of him specifically?" She didn't soften the question or apologize for it. "Those lead to different places. I've watched him rebuild something functional out of very hard material, and I've watched Lily start to look at you the way she looks at things she's decided are worth keeping, and I need to know which one I'm looking at." It was the most clarifying question anyone had asked her in years, not because it was difficult to answer, but because it crystallized something she'd been circling. "Both things are true," Margaret said. "This town is the first place in a long time where I feel like what I've built is one part of me rather than all of me, and that matters." But the reason I keep driving this road is him. I know the difference between those two things, and I know which one is doing the work." Ruth held her gaze for one more beat. Then she picked up her glasses and put them back on. "Good," she said, and returned to her papers. And that was the end of it. The conversation Margaret had been building toward happened on a Thursday afternoon at Millhaven Lake, where the access road had been recently cleared and the parking area at the south end looked out over water that was doing extraordinary things with the October light. He sat on the tailgate of the truck. She stood near her car. The honest distance between them close enough for a real conversation, far enough that everything said was chosen rather than defaulted into. "I knew the car," he said, not as preamble but as the thing itself. "On Miller's Pass. The Calloway Fleet decal on the rear window. I knew who the vehicle belonged to." She had known this was coming since her kitchen floor at midnight. "Why did you stop?" "Because Sarah would have been angry with me if I hadn't." He said it with the flatness of a truth that has been turned over so many times it no longer needs decoration. She used to say, "Whatever you think about an institution, the person standing in front of you is a person. Don't make them pay for the institution." He looked at the water. "And because I've been carrying anger for 3 years, and anger at a name on a letterhead doesn't change what happened to Sarah. And because—" He paused. "And because—" He looked at her. "And because when you stepped out of that car something happened that I don't know how to describe without it sounding like something it might not be. A sense that this was going to matter, that I'd been here before in some way I couldn't account for." He shook his head slightly. I told myself I was confusing the situation. "You weren't." She held the lake in her peripheral vision, kept her eyes on him. "I felt it before I consciously recognized you. Not your face, not your name, something else. The way you tilted your head before you committed to looking at the engine. The specific geometry of how you held still before committing to a problem. The way the whole body listens before the hands move. I'd seen it once and apparently filed it somewhere I couldn't clear." He turned this over. "I didn't recognize you. I want to be honest about that. I drove home thinking I'd had a strange 10 minutes, and that was the end of it. Then I looked up Calloway Group and found your photograph." A pause. "I sat with that for a while." "How long is a while?" "Long enough that Lily asked me twice at dinner why I wasn't eating." She almost smiled. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was thinking about something." "What did she say?" "She said that was fine, but thinking didn't require skipping the green beans." This time she did smile, and he did too, briefly the real kind, and for a moment the lake and the light and the distance between them arranged themselves into something that felt like it had been waiting to be this specific shape. Then he looked down at the tailgate and the smile became something else, not gone, but the thing underneath it visible now. "I need to say something, and I need to say it once clearly so you know what you're working with." She waited. "Lily was 3 when Sarah died. She doesn't carry the before and after the way I do. She carries the absence, which is its own thing, but not the same weight. I carry both. And somewhere in the 2nd year I made a decision that functional was enough. That I had the shop, and I had Lily, and I had Marcus and Ruth, and a life that held together. And wanting more than that was the kind of thinking that gets you hurt when you can't afford to be hurt." His jaw shifted. "And now you've been sitting in my waiting room for 2 weeks, and my daughter has started showing you her collection, and Ruth has started making you coffee without asking, and I'm aware that functional is no longer feeling like enough, and that awareness it's not comfortable." "I know. I don't think you do entirely. Because, from where I'm standing, you're someone who built something remarkable out of a starting point. Most people would have folded at, and you're offering me something, and my instinct is to believe it's real, and my other instinct is to remember that the last time I let something matter completely, it cost me everything I thought I was prepared for, and several things I wasn't." He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you this because if you're going to be here, I'd rather you know the actual shape of what you're walking into than find out later that I was pretending to be less complicated than I am." She listened to all of it. When she was certain he was finished, she said, "I spent 15 years building a company that would make me unassailable. I was very good at it, and I was also very clear-eyed in the private accounting I did on kitchen floors and in the backs of cars about what it was costing me. I don't have a language for what it felt like to stand on that mountain road and watch your taillights and suddenly know I'd been walking past the answer to a question I'd stopped asking." She held his gaze without qualification. "You think I'm offering you something from a position of safety. I'm not. I'm standing here with the same exposure you are. I'm just less practiced at pretending otherwise." The wind moved across the lake and flattened for a moment and moved again. "I'm scared," he said, and the simplicity of it was the most direct thing he'd said to her yet. "I know. So am I." He looked at her hand on the fender of her car, then at her face. The afternoon light was doing its full work on the water behind him, and neither of them was paying any attention to it. He moved his hand from the tailgate to the hood of the truck, not toward her, but in the same direction, a half-step of intention, and let it rest there. "Lily asked me this morning if you were coming today," he said. "What did you tell her?" "I said I thought so." "That's the most optimistic thing you've said to me yet." The corner of his mouth. "I'm working up to it," he said. And the thing underneath the words was clearer than the words, and she let it be clear without requiring him to make it more explicit than he was ready to make it. Lily appeared from the parking area, then having been released from 40 minutes in the car, with the particular velocity of a child who has identified possibilities in a new space and is moving toward them. She stopped when she registered the proximity and the quality of the air between the two adults, and assessed it with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to pretend she doesn't notice what she notices. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked Margaret. "If that's all right." Lily gave this approximately 2 seconds of consideration. "Yes," she said with the finality of someone who has not asked a question but confirmed a decision, and walked toward the water to look at something she'd spotted near the shoreline. Dan watched his daughter crouch at the water's edge with a focus that had nothing to do with anything except whatever she'd found. "She voted," he said quietly. "I noticed. Her votes don't get appealed. I gathered that about her." He was quiet for a moment watching Lily. Then, without looking at Margaret, "I'm glad you came back. Every time." He said it the way he said things that mattered, without ceremony, without building toward it, just placed it in the air between them and left it there. "I want you to know that." She looked at the side of his face, at the lines that had come from years of work and weather, and the specific kind of weathering that grief does on a person who doesn't quit, at the way he watched his daughter with the particular quality of love that doesn't need to announce itself. "I know," she said, and she did. The dinner was pasta assembled from what the kitchen offered, and Lily narrated the entire meal a disagreement at school about apex predators, the injustice of spelling tests that included words Lily classified as adult vocabulary, the broken pocket watch, and the history of its provenance as she understood it. Dan corrected 2 minor factual errors about the watch's origins and let the rest stand. Margaret asked questions that were genuine rather than polite, and Lily answered them with the seriousness the questions deserved. Afterward, when Lily was in bed, 2 trips back down, once for water, once for the unspecified reason children have at the end of days when they're not quite ready to let go of what the day contained. Margaret and Dan sat at the kitchen table with what remained of the evening between them, and she said, "Tell me about Sarah if you want to." He considered the question with the care he brought to things he intended to answer honestly. Then he told her a genuinely good woman, patient in the way of someone who had made peace with the fact that patience produces better outcomes than urgency. She had loved Lily from the first moment with a quality of recognition that had something inexplicable in it, as though she'd known her before. She had known Dan was carrying something he'd never fully set down, had told him once without blame that she could feel the shape of it even without knowing its contents, and had loved him without requiring him to produce it or explain it. "I gave her everything I knew how to access," he said. "I've worked through most of what I feel about the gap between that and everything. What I've held on to, because she deserved honesty, even posthumously, is the acknowledgement that the gap existed, and that she knew it, and that she decided what we had was worth staying for anyway." He looked at Margaret steadily. "I'm telling you this because I want you to know the actual version of my life, not the version that's easier to present." "The actual version is what I want," she said. Later, when they moved to the back porch and the Blue Ridge sat in the dark beyond the fence in the enormous and indifferent way it always sat. His phone buzzed on the railing. He looked at it. Something moved in his expression. Not the relaxed neutrality, but a different layer, cooler, more contained. He picked the phone up and set it down face up where she could see the screen. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. Mr. Rourke. This is Preston Hale, CFO of Calloway Group. I'd like to speak with you privately at your earliest convenience regarding an arrangement that could resolve the Vanguard matter in a way that significantly exceeds your previous settlement outcome. I believe this conversation would be mutually beneficial. Please contact me at your convenience. She read it. Read it again. The cold air off the mountains was the same air it had been a minute ago and felt entirely different. Dan looked at her. Do you want to explain it, or should I read it the way it reads? Read it the way it reads. Her voice was level, but something behind her sternum had gone tight. He wants to pay you to disappear before the board vote. The vote on whether to remove you. Yes. He turned the phone face down on the railing. How long has he been watching you? Long enough to have a file. He told me last week he knew about you. I think he's been building toward this for months. She looked at the dark line of the mountains. He's expecting you to take it, to give him something to point to that the payout was a transaction rather than a correction. Dan was quiet for a moment with the particular quality she'd come to recognize as his processing register, not absence, the active opposite of absence, something happening below the surface that would eventually arrive as action. What happens to the audit if I take it? It continues. I've already set it in motion. But it becomes very easy for Preston to argue in front of the board that the whole sequence, the audit, the restitution, all of it was motivated by my relationship with one specific claimant rather than by the institutional problem. She paused. He can make the math look like something it isn't. Dan picked up the phone, held it for a moment, then placed it in her hand, not her palm, set it in her fingers deliberately, the way you hand someone something they'll need. You should have that, he said. If he contacts you about it, you should be able to show you knew from the moment it arrived and that you didn't try to manage it quietly. His voice carried the same flatness as when he'd told her he wasn't taking her money on the mountain road, not a performance of principle, but the thing itself stated plainly because stating it plainly was sufficient. I'm not going to call him back. I'm not going to take his money. And I'm not going to make myself scarce because it's politically convenient for someone I've never met. He looked at her. That's not negotiable. She looked down at the phone in her hand, then at him. I know what this could cost you. If Preston escalates, then he escalates. He said it with the quiet of someone who has already run the calculation and arrived at a conclusion they can live with. I spent 3 years watching my daughter grow up knowing that a company decided our family wasn't worth the cost of what they'd promised us. I'm not going to help that same company's CFO maneuver his way into control because standing still is inconvenient for his timeline. Something in his expression that was not quite anger, sharper than resignation, stiller than fury. Doing the right thing when there's no cost isn't virtue, it's just convenience. The porch was cold. Neither of them moved to go inside. She thought about page 14 of a 22-page document, about 31 families and 4 bankers' boxes, and the arithmetic of what it had cost to keep those denials intact, about the woman in the photograph posted every December laughing at something outside the frame, the mountains behind her. I've built something considerable, she said, and I've done it by understanding which costs were worth paying. I know the difference between a cost that's worth it and one that isn't. She looked at him. This one is worth it. Whatever Preston does with the board, the right thing here has a clear shape, and I'm not interested in any version of this where I look away from it, because the timing is awkward. He looked at her for a long moment. The mountains held their position in the dark. Somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and went quiet. Come back Thursday, he said. It wasn't a question. It was the thing after the thing, the part where the conversation that had been happening underneath the one they were having surfaced briefly into plain air. Lily has a soccer game in the morning. She's been talking about it since Tuesday, and she won't score a single goal, but she will have opinions about every aspect of the proceedings. I'll be there Thursday, she said. He nodded, looked out at the mountains. The evening settled around them in the particular way of Blue Ridge October nights, cold and clear and full of whatever a person brought to it, and what she brought to it was the specific and unfamiliar sensation of having said exactly what she meant to exactly the right person, and of having been heard in the precise way she'd meant it. She drove home on Route 33 with the mountains behind her and Preston's text message in her phone, and the smell of pasta and the particular quiet of a house with a child asleep in it still faintly present in her memory, and thought about a man who had handed her a piece of evidence rather than a problem, and about a child who voted with the same seriousness she brought to extinct predators, and about 31 families who were going to receive a letter in the coming weeks telling them that what had been taken from them would be returned. She thought about what it cost to do the right thing and what it cost not to, and the road ahead was long and straight and entirely clear. The independent audit came back on a Tuesday 3 weeks before the board vote, delivered in a single PDF by the external firm she'd hired, a boutique litigation support practice out of Charlottesville with no prior relationship with Calloway Group or any of its subsidiaries, which had been the first criterion. The lead auditor called her before sending the document, a professional courtesy that also served as a warning the findings were not going to make anyone comfortable. 31 of the 41 denials were indefensible under Vanguard Life's own policy language correctly interpreted. The remaining 10 were genuinely ambiguous cases where the exclusion language, though inadequately disclosed, had been applied in ways that fell within a reasonable reading of the contract. 31 families had been denied claims they were owed. The aggregate dollar amount, including applicable interest calculated from denial date, was $4.1 million. She read the full report in 2 hours. Then she called her general counsel and said, "I want letters drafted to all 31 families within the week. Full restitution plus interest. I want a personal apology on Calloway Group letterhead, not a legal disclaimer dressed up as an apology, actual language acknowledging what happened and why it was wrong." She paused. "And I want a policy review team assembled to look at the exclusion structure across all Vanguard products. If this category of problem exists in 41 cases, it exists elsewhere, and I want to know where before anyone else finds it." Her general counsel, who had been with the company for 9 years and had developed over that time a reliable sense of when Margaret Calloway had made a decision that was fully made, and when she was still open to input, said nothing for a moment and then said, "The board meeting is in 3 weeks. I know when the board meeting is. This document, if it becomes public before Friday." "When it becomes public," she said, "it becomes public because I put it on the agenda. Get me the draft letters." She drove to Millhaven that Thursday. Not to tell Dan about the audit results, he would receive a letter like everyone else, formal and accountable, because she had decided early that the way the Vanguard situation was handled could not have different tracks for different people based on her personal relationship to them. The letter would go to the address on file for Rourke's Auto and Body, and it would say what it needed to say, and she would not be there when he opened it. That was the boundary she'd drawn for herself, and she'd drawn it deliberately, and she held it. She drove to Millhaven because it was Thursday, and because she'd said she would come back, and because the version of her life that included Thursday drives on Route 33 was the version she was choosing. Marcus was sitting on the bench outside the hardware store when she pulled in, thermos in hand, as though he'd been placed there to receive information. He raised the thermos in her direction, which she'd come to understand was his primary mode of acknowledgement, and went back to watching the street with the satisfaction of a man who has no pressing obligations and finds this entirely appropriate. She found Dan in the second bay working on what appeared to be a 1968 Ford Bronco in a state of ambitious restoration, stripped to the frame in sections, the engine pulled, and sitting on a stand, the body panels showing the particular kind of rust that comes from decades of honest use rather than neglect. He was measuring something on the frame with a tape and a level when she came in, and he looked up and held the level steady while he said, "Third shelf above the bench, blue binder. There's a section on frame corrosion specs if you want something to read while I finish this measurement." She got the binder, sat on the rolling stool in the corner of the bay. Read about frame corrosion specifications for a 1968 Ford Bronco while he worked, and there was something in the domestic normality of this, the shop sounds, the particular smell of the place, the quality of the light through the bay door on an October afternoon that she held carefully the way you hold something you know is real but haven't yet fully trusted as permanent. "Who brought it in?" she asked when he'd finished the measurement. "Guy from Harrisonburg. His grandfather drove it for 20 years. Then it sat in a barn for 30. He wants it back to running condition, not show condition. Working truck, not a museum piece." "What's the difference?" He set the tape on the workbench and looked at the Bronco with the expression she'd seen him bring to problems he found genuinely interesting. "Museum piece you preserve exactly as it is, even the wear. Working truck you restore to function, replace what's failed, keep what hasn't. The cosmetics don't matter except where they protect the mechanics underneath." He picked up a flashlight, directed it at a section of the frame. "Some people get that confused. They think preservation means leaving everything alone. But if you leave the rust alone, it takes the whole frame eventually. You have to do something about the rot, or everything else you're protecting goes with it." She thought about the Vanguard files in their 4 bankers' boxes, about the exclusion language on page 14 of a 22-page document, about the difference between a problem acknowledged and a problem addressed. "That's a useful way to think about it," she said. He glanced at her over the flashlight beam. He understood she wasn't talking about the Bronco. The letter from Calloway Group arrived at Rourke's Auto and Body on a Monday morning, 11 days before the board vote. Ruth signed for it as she signed for all business correspondence and set it on Dan's desk in the back office, which was a desk that had been his father's desk, solid oak, scarred from decades of use, organized in a way that suggested function had priority and appearance was irrelevant. Dan found it when he came in from the bay at the lunch break. He read it standing up, which Margaret knew because Ruth told her later in the specific way Ruth transmitted information factually without editorializing as pure report. He read it through twice, set it down, stood at the window that looked out at the parking lot for a few minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called her. "I got the letter," he said. "I know." She was in her office in Richmond. The city spread behind her through the glass, a draft of her board presentation on the screen in front of her. "I wanted you to hear from the letter first. Before me. The check will cover the legal fees." His voice was steady, but something moved underneath it, a current that didn't break the surface. "And then some. It should cover them with interest. That was the calculation." A silence. Then, "There are 23 other families in this. 31 total. The audit found 31 defensible denials." He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the particular silence of the shop through the phone, distant metal, the low frequency of the lift, normal sounds that meant everything was running. "Did you know the number when you started the audit?" he asked. "I knew it was more than one." "That's not what I mean. I mean, when you commissioned it, did you know it was going to come back at a scale that would cost the company real money and give Preston Hale ammunition to use at the board meeting?" "Yes." "And you did it anyway." "I did it because it was the right thing to do. You, of all people, should recognize that framework." A short pause, and then something that was almost a laugh, not quite, but the precursor to one, the intake of breath before amusement that doesn't quite complete. "I'll see you Thursday," he said, "if you're still coming." "I'm still coming." She spent the days between the letter and the board meeting in a kind of split attention she'd never quite operated in before, present in Richmond for the preparation that needed doing, present in Mill Haven for the reasons that didn't reduce to strategy. Preston's campaign had not slowed after the text to Dan had gone unanswered. He had reached out to 2 additional board members she knew of, framing the Vanguard payout as evidence of impaired judgment, and he had placed a story with a financial news outlet in Richmond that ran under a headline she'd expected and felt the impact of. Regardless, Calloway CEO's personal ties raise questions about $4 million subsidiary payout. The story was factually accurate in its components and misleading in its architecture, which was a particular kind of effective. She read it once, noted which board members had been quoted anonymously expressing concern, and went back to her preparation. She had 14 members to account for. She needed 8. Eleanor Marsh was one she'd been thinking about for 2 weeks. Eleanor had served on the Calloway board for 11 years. She was 68, held the largest individual stake among non-executive members, and had a reputation for saying very little in meetings, and being the person whose opinion, when finally expressed, carried the weight of everything unsaid before it. She had voted with Margaret on 5 significant resolutions in the past 3 years, and had never once explained her reasoning afterward, which Margaret had come to understand as a form of respect. The vote-spoke explanation would be condescension. She called Eleanor on a Wednesday evening 2 days before the board meeting. "I know you're going to vote your conscience regardless of this call," Margaret said when Eleanor picked up. "I'm not calling to lobby you. I'm calling because I think you deserve to hear directly from me what the Vanguard audit found and why I authorized the payout, and I want to say it in my own words rather than have you work from Preston's version." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Go ahead," Margaret told her. The full account, the files, the exclusion language, the 31 families, the arithmetic of what Vanguard had saved against what those families had lost. She told her about Dan's case specifically, not as a personal disclosure, but as the case she knew most completely because it was the one she'd read 9 times and could speak to without notes. She told her about the text Preston had sent to Dan's phone. When she finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I've been on this board for 11 years. In 11 years I have seen 3 CEOs, and I want to tell you something that I have not said to any of them because it wasn't applicable." A pause. "The test of a leader isn't what they do when the decision is easy. It's what they do when doing the right thing has a real cost and doing the expedient thing is available. You had an expedient path here, several of them. You didn't take any of them." Another pause. "I'll see you Friday." She called Margaret back 20 minutes later. "One more thing. Preston has been buying Vanguard Life subsidiary bonds through a shell account at Hargrove Capital for the past 18 months. He knew about the denial rate before the audit because he had access to Vanguard's internal risk reports through the Hargrove due diligence process, and he used that information to buy into an asset he knew was more valuable than its disclosed risk profile suggested." Her voice was entirely level. "I have the documentation. I've had it for several weeks. I was waiting to see what you were going to do before I decided what to do with it." Margaret sat with this for a moment. "You were testing me." "I was gathering information," Eleanor said. "What you choose to call it is up to you. What do you want to do with the documentation?" "That's a question for Friday," Eleanor said. "Bring your best version." The Friday board meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning in the main conference room on 22, a room Margaret had spent more cumulative hours in than she could calculate: quarterly reviews, strategic sessions, the crisis meeting when the Hargrove preliminary term sheet had first landed, and half the room had gone immediately to enthusiastic. The room had good light, a table that seated 18 and a whiteboard on the south wall that still had a faint ghost of something written on it 6 months ago that no one had fully erased. She'd noticed that ghost every time she'd been in the room since. She noticed it now as she set up her materials, the faint reminder of a conversation that had already happened. Preston arrived 8 minutes before 10, which was his habit, early enough to establish presence, late enough to avoid the appearance of anxiety. He was wearing the charcoal suit with the faint chalk stripe that he wore to meetings he considered important, and he had the contained energy of someone who believes the outcome is already determined and is managing the interval between now and confirmation. He set his materials at his usual seat, 2 to her right, and said good morning to 2 board members who arrived immediately behind him with the warmth of a man reinforcing relationships he'd been working on. He did not acknowledge her directly until he had to, which told her everything she needed to know about his confidence level. The meeting opened with the standard operations report, which she delivered in 16 minutes, clean, factual, no editorializing. Revenue was tracking 2% above projection. The Hargrove due diligence was proceeding. The Vanguard audit results were on the agenda under new business. Preston moved to take the floor before she reached new business, requesting time for what he called a governance matter. The board chair, Gerald Forthright, 62, former investment banker, the kind of chairman who was better at managing process than making calls, looked at the agenda, looked at Preston, and nodded. Preston was fluent. She gave him that. He had been preparing this longer than she had known it was coming, and it showed in the structure the concern framed as institutional responsibility rather than personal agenda. The timeline presented cleanly, the photographs of her Richmond to Millhaven schedule laid out without comment, because he understood that the comment was unnecessary if the picture was clear enough. He had the text message exchange, or rather, he had a screenshot of his own outgoing message without Dan's non-response, which was the particular selective presentation of someone who had learned how to show a partial truth. "I want to be clear," Preston said to the room, rather than to her specifically, "that I am raising this not as an attack on our CEO's character, but as a question of whether the Vanguard payout decision, regardless of its ethical merits, was made in a context that compromised the appearance of impartiality. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to ask that question." Several faces around the table had the careful neutrality of people who had been expecting this and were reserving judgment. Several others had the slightly too attentive look of people who had been privately briefed and were watching to see how the pieces landed. She let him finish. She did not interrupt, did not visibly react, did not make any of the small physical adjustments, the slight forward lean the pen set down firmly that people make when they want the room to know they're preparing to respond. She simply listened with the same quality of attention she gave everything which had the effect she'd found over the years of making people slightly uncertain about whether they'd landed the blow they intended. Then she stood up. "I'd like to address the governance question," she said, "and then I'd like to show the board something they haven't seen." She walked through the Vanguard audit in 20 minutes. Not a summary, the actual findings, case-by-case structure, methodology, conclusions. She had prepared for the possibility that Preston would try to dismiss the audit as internally motivated, so she had included in her presentation the external firm's credentials and the explicit independence clause in their engagement letter. She showed the aggregate figure $4.1 million in improper denials over 7 years. She showed the projected legal exposure if any of the 31 families retained specialized insurance litigation counsel, a number that made the restitution look not like a cost, but like a hedge. She showed the policy reform proposal her team had drafted, which would eliminate the exclusion category that had generated the problem across all Vanguard products. "The question before the board," she said, "is not whether I have a personal relationship with someone affected by the Vanguard situation. I do, and I disclosed it to General Counsel before commissioning the audit, and the engagement letter explicitly accounts for it through the independent structure. The question is whether the audit's findings are accurate and whether the recommended action is in the company's interest." She looked at the faces around the table. "I believe the answer to both questions is yes. I invite anyone who disagrees to identify a specific finding they consider inaccurate." Preston leaned forward. "The question, Margaret, is about the sequence. The relationship existed before the audit was commissioned. That sequence, the relationship became relevant to me," she said, steady, "on the same evening that I found the Vanguard file. I read the case that night. I commissioned the audit the following Monday. The sequence you're describing is exactly the sequence that should happen when a CEO discovers a problem and responds to it." She held his gaze across the table. "What would you have preferred? That I find the problem and sit on it?" Eleanor Marsh, who had said nothing for the first 90 minutes of the meeting, set a manila envelope on the table. She did not open it immediately. She looked at Preston for a moment with the particular quality of attention that comes from having spent 11 years watching someone and having finally arrived at a conclusion. "Before we vote on the confidence question," Eleanor said, "I'd like to put something on the record." She opened the envelope. "Over the past 18 months, Preston Hale has purchased approximately $2.3 million in Vanguard Life subsidiary instruments through an account associated with Hargrove Capital Partners. He had access to Vanguard's internal risk reporting through the Hargrove due diligence process, reporting that included the denial rate data the independent audit has now made public." She set the documentation on the table. "This is the definition of trading on material non-public information. I have retained outside securities counsel, and this documentation will be forwarded to the relevant regulatory authority regardless of what this board decides today. I am placing it on the record here because this board deserves to know the full context of who is raising the governance question and why." The room was very still. Preston's expression did not collapse. He was too experienced for that, but something went out of it the way a fire goes out when the available oxygen is consumed. He looked at the documentation. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Margaret briefly with the expression of a man recalculating a position he'd believed was secure. Gerald Forthright said, after a long moment, "I think we should take a short recess." The recess lasted 22 minutes. When the room reconvened, two board members who had been in Preston's column at the start of the morning had shifted in ways that were visible in their posture before a word was said. The confidence vote when it came was 11-3 in her favor. Preston abstained, which under the circumstances was a form of acknowledgement. He left the room before the formal adjournment, and he did not return to the building after that day. In the weeks that followed, the legal process would proceed on its own track outside Securities Council, regulatory filing a process that was no longer Margaret's primary responsibility to manage. What was hers to manage was the company and the Vanguard reform and the 31 letters that went out and the 31 responses that came back over the following weeks, some brief and formal, some longer, several of them difficult to read in ways she read them carefully anyway, because difficulty was not a reason to look away. She drove to Millhaven that Friday evening. She had not called ahead. The drive took the familiar shape of a thing done enough times to have become its own kind of knowledge. The interstate west, the exit onto the two-lane, the farms, and the second-growth forest, the valley opening up. It was late afternoon by the time she pulled onto Main Street, the light going amber and low, the hardware store closed, Millie's diner showing lights and the shapes of the dinner crowd through the window. The lights were on at Rourke's Auto and Body. One bay door still open. She parked, walked across the street, found him in the back of the first bay not working, sitting on an overturned bucket with his forearms on his knees and a cup of coffee going cold in one hand, looking at the Bronco the way people look at things that require patience. They're in the process of gathering. He looked up when she came in, looked at her face, which she knew told him something because he nodded once, a single slow nod. 11-3, she said, and Preston has a different set of problems now. He set the coffee cup on the workbench, stood up from the bucket with the particular economy of motion she'd been watching for 7 weeks now, the body of a man who knows how to move without wasted effort. He looked at her for a moment, the full look, not the managed version, and said, "You drove an hour." "I told you I would." "I know you did." "Boy." Something shifted in his expression, the last layer of the careful neutrality coming down, and what was underneath it was not what she'd expected, which was relief or confirmation, but something quieter and more serious than either. "I need to say something, and I need to say it now before dinner and before Lily comes home, and before any of the normal things that make it easier to not say the hard things." She stood still and let him come to it. "I've been watching you for 7 weeks, he said. "I've watched you sit in my waiting room and work for 6 hours and eat Ruth's biscuits and talk to my daughter about prehistoric predators with the same seriousness you'd bring to a board presentation. I've watched you read about frame corrosion specifications because I handed you the binder. I've watched you tell me uncomfortable truths when you didn't have to, and drive this road when you had 100 reasons not to, and handle the Vanguard situation the way it needed to be handled, even when I knew it was costing you something at work that you couldn't fully afford to pay." He stopped. His jaw shifted. "I told you I was scared. That was true. I'm still scared. But I've been thinking about something my mother used to say, which is that the only things worth being scared of are the things worth having, because the things that don't matter don't make you afraid." She waited. "I loved Sarah," he said. "That's true, and it's permanent, and it's not in competition with anything else I'm about to say. I loved her the way you love someone who chooses you and stays and builds something real with you. And I've carried the weight of not having given her my whole self, and I've made my peace with most of that weight, and part of making peace with it was understanding that what I'd kept back wasn't something I'd withheld from her willfully, it was something I didn't know how to access." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to understand as one of his native qualities, the way some people are natively funny or natively warm. "And then you were standing on the shoulder of Route 33 with your hood up, and I pulled over, and within 10 minutes I knew, not consciously, not in any way I could have articulated, but knew that I was looking at the thing I'd been keeping back." The bay was quiet around them. The Bronco sat in its state of patient disassembly. 15 years ago," he continued, "I sat on a bench with you until the sky went light, and I kissed you, and I meant every word of that sentence I said, and then my phone rang and I went home, because that was what the situation required, and there was no other version of that story I could have told. But I never stopped turning that night over. Not when I was building the shop, not when I met Sarah, not when Lily was born. Some nights are load-bearing in a way you don't understand until much later, and that night was load-bearing, and I think part of why I stopped being fully present in my own life for a while after Sarah died was that I had two of those nights, the night I met you and the night I lost her, and they were both sitting in the same weight-bearing place, and I didn't know how to distribute the load." She realized her throat had tightened. She let it. "I love you," he said. The words came out without ceremony, which was the only way they could have come from him, direct and undecorated, the way he said everything that mattered. "I loved you at 23 on a campus bench, and I love who you are now, which is not the same person and is built from 15 years of hard work that I have watched the results of, and that I find it remarkable, honestly. Not because you run a company, because of the way you run it. Because of the way you sit on a kitchen floor when you need to think and eat biscuits that cost $1 without comparing them to Richmond restaurants, and tell my daughter that the T-Rex's visual limitations are a legitimate area of scientific inquiry." The corner of his mouth moved. "I love you because of the specific way you are, and I am done being careful about saying it." She crossed the 3 steps between them. She placed her hand on the side of his face, the rough jaw, the particular temperature of him, and felt his hand come up to cover hers, and she said, "I've been in love with you since before I knew I was looking for you. 15 years ago and right now, and every point in between that I was too sensible to call by its right name." Her voice was steady in the way of something finally at rest. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to keep driving this road on Thursdays, and I'm going to keep eating Ruth's biscuits, and I'm going to learn what I need to know about the Broncos' frame specifications, and I'm going to be here. That's not a negotiation, and it's not contingent, it's just what's true." He kissed her. Not like 15 years ago, that had been tentative, a beginning testing its own edges. This was the kiss of two people who have already agreed on the terms and are now simply arriving at the place they've been walking toward, and it held the weight of everything that had preceded it without being crushed by it. From outside the bay door, the sound of a school bus. They separated, and he straightened, and she turned to look out the bay door, and Lily Rourke came down the sidewalk at the particular velocity of a child who has spotted a familiar car across the street and has assembled the available evidence into a conclusion. She stopped at the bay door, looked at Dan, looked at Margaret, looked at the quality of the air between them, the way children look at things adults try to make invisible with the merciless accuracy of someone who has not yet learned to pretend otherwise. "You were here when I got home," Lily said to Margaret. "I was. You're going to be here for dinner, if that's all right." Lily turned this over for approximately 2 seconds, which appeared to be all the deliberation the question required. "Becca from school said her mom says it's weird when people's dads have girlfriends." She set her backpack down inside the bay door, considered this. "I told her that Becca's mom has never had to fix a carburetor, so maybe she doesn't know everything." Dan put his hand over his mouth. "I don't know what that means exactly," Lily continued with the self-awareness of someone who has deployed a reference for effect rather than substance. "But Grandpa says carburetors are complicated, and most people don't understand them, so it seemed like the right thing to say." Margaret crouched down to Lily's level. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think your grandfather was right about carburetors, and I think Becca's mother might come around eventually." Lily assessed her for a moment with the full focus of those dark eyes. "Are you going to live here?" "Lily," Dan said, "I'm asking a reasonable question." Lily looked entirely untroubled by the suggestion that the question might be premature. "Because if you're going to be here a lot, we should probably move the extra chair from the garage into the kitchen, because there are only 2 kitchen chairs and 3 people, and that's a math problem." Margaret looked at Dan over Lily's head. He had the expression of a man who has been undone by an 8-year-old's logistics and has no defense against it. "The chair from the garage sounds like a good solution," Margaret said. "Okay." Lily picked up her backpack. I'm going to put my stuff inside and then I'm going to tell you about what we learned about the extinction event today because it's important. And a lot of people have the wrong idea about it. She walked toward the door to the office interior, then stopped and looked back at Margaret with the particular expression she brought to things she'd decided were settled. I'm glad you came back. Every time. Then she went inside and the door swung shut, and the sound of her footsteps on the stairs to the back office faded. Dan looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then he looked at Margaret. She voted, he said. She voted. Her votes are final. There's no appeal process. I gathered that. He shook his head slightly the way he did when something had arrived that he couldn't quite account for using his existing categories, and she saw in the motion the same quality she'd seen in him from the beginning, the willingness to receive the world as it actually was, rather than as he'd predicted it would be, and to adjust accordingly without drama. 2 months later, on a Saturday morning in December, she was sitting in the bleachers of the Millhaven Elementary athletic field with a paper cup of coffee that had cost $1 from the concession table and was, she'd decided, significantly better than it had any right to be. The field was cold. The sky was the flat white of a Virginia December, overcast, snow in it somewhere but not yet falling. 6 8-year-olds in green jerseys were arrayed across the grass in configurations that bore an approximate relationship to soccer formation. A 7th was Lily, who was currently standing at the edge of the field in a way that suggested her attention had been drawn to something along the sideline. Dan was beside her on the bleachers. Marcus was 1 row back, thermos in hand, wearing a canvas jacket and the expression of a man who had attended every one of these games for 2 years and had not yet seen Lily score but maintained his attendance on principle. She's looking at a grasshopper, Dan said. In December, Lily finds things other people don't see. The coach called a play. Lily looked up with the expression of someone returning from a brief but satisfying journey and began moving toward the ball in the particular running style of a child who has not yet decided whether speed is the primary variable. The ball came off another player's foot at an angle no one appeared to have intended, and it hit Lily in the shin at the exact moment she was lifting her foot for her next step, and the combination of these 2 accidents sent the ball in a line directly into the goal. The small crowd on the bleachers produced a sound that was probably disproportionate to the event. Margaret was on her feet. Dan was on his feet. Marcus behind them said something that sounded like, "There it is," in the tone of a man whose faith has been vindicated after a long wait. Lily stood in the penalty box looking at the goal, then at her shin, then at the goal again with the expression of someone assembling evidence. Then she turned and pointed directly at the bleachers at them, specifically a deliberate and identifying gesture, and her face broke into the open, uncomplicated joy of a child for whom the good things are still fully available. They cheered until the people around them were laughing, and Margaret felt something in her chest that she recognized after a moment as the sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which she had spent years building context for, and then spent those same years not actually feeling. After the game, Lily came off the field with grass stains on both knees and the grasshopper cupped in her hands. She showed Margaret first a late-season specimen improbably surviving green and specific. "He was under the sideline marker," Lily said. "That's why I was looking. I wanted to make sure no one stepped on him." "Where will you put him?" "Back by the fence, near the milkweed." She looked at the grasshopper with the expression she brought to things she was deciding the fate of, serious considered. "He'll be okay there." She carried the grasshopper to the fence at the field's edge and set him in the dry grass and watched him for a moment before coming back. Then she took Margaret's hand on the left and her father's hand on the right, and they walked to the car that way, and Lily talked about the extinction event for 7 uninterrupted minutes, and neither adult spoke, both of them listening, both of them held. That evening, after Lily was in bed, one trip back down for the glass of water that was a nightly fixed point. One trip for the reason she couldn't articulate, but which both adults understood was a need to confirm the house was still arranged correctly. Dan and Margaret sat on the back porch in the December cold with blankets and the remnants of 2 cups of tea, and the Blue Ridge sat in the dark beyond the fence in the way it always sat, indifferent and enormous and somehow companionable. "I keep thinking about what you said," Dan told her. The porch had become theirs in a way that had happened gradually, the way most permanent things happen, too slow to notice until it was already true. About the night on the road, not recognizing me until the taillights. I recognized you before I knew I was recognizing you. That's the part." He looked at the dark shape of the mountains. "I've been thinking about why that is, what it says about the way we know people." Then he stopped, reformulating. "I think the things that are really true about a person aren't visible in their face or their name. They're in the way they move through a problem, the angle of attention." His shoulder was against hers under the blanket, solid and warm. "I think you recognized the angle. I think you're right. And I think—" He stopped again, and she waited, and after a moment he said, "I think the 15 years weren't lost time. I think we both had to go through all of it to be able to sit here without flinching. If you'd found me at 24 or 28 or 32, I'd have been a different version, and so would you, and I don't think either version would have had what this requires." She thought about the scholarship and the patched coat and the company she'd built one quarter at a time, and the 41 files and the banker's boxes and the boardroom with its whiteboard ghost, and the kitchen floor at midnight. She thought about Sarah's photograph posted every December, and Lily's curated garden, and Marcus's thermos raised without comment, and Ruth's coffee placed on the counter before it was requested. "We weren't ready then," she said. "You had to go home. I had to build the thing I needed to build, and we had to become the versions of ourselves that could actually do this." "Couldn't have planned it," he said. "Wouldn't have trusted it if we had." The mountains held the cold and the dark, as they'd been holding it for a long time before either of them arrived in this valley, and would hold it long after. The grasshopper was somewhere in the dry grass near the milkweed. The pocket watch on its flat slate was face up under a light coating of December frost, hands stopped at 2:17, case kept clean. She thought about a sentence said in the blue light before dawn 15 years ago on a campus bench by someone who didn't yet know the shape of his own life. "I want to remember this night forever." And about a road in the mountains and taillights going small in the evening, sour in the particular angle of a man's head when he's really listening, and the way love doesn't always arrive on schedule or announce itself clearly, but sometimes pulls over on a gravel shoulder in the near dark and fixes what's broken and asks nothing in return, and is still there in the morning and the morning after that, and the one after that, not because the calendar was convenient or the circumstances were arranged, but because when the thing is real, it is patient in the way of the mountains, and waits as long as it needs to wait, and is there when you finally look.